if India thinks only of acquiring technology outside of actively operating with the United States military, that is going to be a harder and harder sell because the US is most liberal with technology transfers if we are actually operating with the recipient of the technologies.
Right.
Which is why our allies usually get first dibs because they're constantly operating with us, right? So one of the things we have to think about is how can India and the United States operate, their militaries operate, in a range of missions, which makes the technology transfer easier.
You're watching the gist on Strategies Global. I'm Ramananda Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted to have our guest today, Dr. Ashley Tellis, and we're at the Carnegie 9th Global Summit, Technology Summit. Dr. Tellis, thank you so much for joining us. I
Pleasure.
appreciate you for coming in here. Let me start with a very straight question. So I was reading an article of yours just some time back where you spoke about India's feigned optimism vis-a-vis the US. Now that's going against what I'm hearing from New Delhi. Everybody seems very gung-ho, saying we've dealt with Trump before. And so where is that coming from?
I think India is making a really concerted effort to protect the relationship with the United States.
Right.
And sometimes that takes them in the direction of being far more enthusiastic than I think the reality actually is. This doesn't mean that India is not serious or that the optimism is fake, but it does mean that it is exaggerated.
Okay.
And it is, I think, exaggerated for effect, and the effect being really to protect the relationship.
Okay, so that's the main reason. The second question that I wanted to ask, and based on the same article where you spoke about this feigned optimism, is that Trump doesn't seem to set much store in terms of India being some kind of a counterweight to China and things like that. But that's an argument that India keeps saying that we don't want to be seen as a counterweight, but at the same time, there is the impression. How would you like to explain that?
So it is, Trump is in many ways quite idiosyncratic. Now, we've had a relationship with India that has been dramatically improving, at least since President Clinton came to India in 2000, right? At the back of our minds, in every case, was we want this great relationship with India for two reasons. One, for its own sake, because India is a democracy, and we missed many opportunities during the Cold War. And then second, because it is part of a power balance in Asia that we want to preserve.
Right.
The problem is Trump represents a really remarkable deviation from that baseline, because it is not obvious to me that he cares very much about preserving a favorable balance of power in Asia.
Okay.
And even if he wants that, he has certainly not identified policies that will get us there.
Okay.
I think he thinks of the relationship with India in very narrow bilateral terms. It's a trading relationship. It's a relationship that may be between our two societies. There are commercial opportunities. And there may be some vague strategic benefits because India is a democracy. It's a friend of the United States. But I don't think he's someone who's conscious geopolitically. And so in that sense, if what I'm saying is true, then this would be a remarkable exception, given where a series of American presidents have been, since 2000. And we still have to understand the implications of what this means.
Of course, I think the world is still waking up every morning wondering what comes next.
Yes, of course. Of course.
The third question I wanted to ask you, sir, is that, this is the Technology Summit. India seems to be very keen on getting, or rather is hoping, that, a lot of the technology deals that were in the pipeline for a long time, that we might start getting it now. Would you be optimistic about it, particularly when it comes to defense tech?
Broadly speaking, I think yes, because the trends have been moving in a certain direction for the last 20 years. And that is a willingness to sell more and more advanced technology to India. But you also have to recognize that there are constraints.
Right.
You know, as I mentioned yesterday, if India thinks only of acquiring technology outside of actively operating with the United States military, that is going to be a harder and harder sell. Because the US is most liberal with technology transfers if we are actually operating with the recipient of the technologies.
Right.
Which is why our allies usually get first dibs because they're constantly operating with us, right? So one of the things we have to think about is how can India and the United States operate, their militaries operate, in a range of missions, which makes the technology transfer easier. So that's one issue that has to be addressed. The second issue that has to be addressed is simply the fact that US technology is very expensive.
True.
Because it is designed for a first world military. India's defense budgets, even though they are substantial in absolute terms, they are not substantial in relative terms. So when you compare it to the defense budgets of, say, Saudi Arabia, or the United States, or NATO, or Japan,
Or even China.
or let alone China. I didn't say China because we don't sell to them,
True.
right? But when you do those comparisons, you find that the defense budget is actually modest.
Right.
And the procurement component of their defense budget is even more modest. So even if technology is available in principle, it's not as if India can take US technology and simply replace what has been relatively inexpensive Russian technology one for one. That is simply going to be a constraint. I mean, and we have to recognize that.
Of course it's
So I suspect what the future is going to bring is Indian reliance on high value, low density assets, where India is going to purchase technologies that provide very high capability, but are not required in extraordinary numbers.
For example.
Like, for example, a P-8 anti-submarine
Okay.
platform. You know, India will buy 20, 24, but it's not going to buy 100,
I get it.
right? India is not going to buy a US tank to replace its Russian origin tank fleet
Right.
for 3,000. In fact, the Striker program will be very interesting. Will India use the Striker program to eventually do one-for-one replacements of all the BMPs and the BTRs? I don't know. And if it does,
I doubt it.
exactly. And if it does, it would be quite remarkable. So I think India is going to go to the US for niche technologies. And to my mind, that's good enough. That's good enough. I mean, look, our objective ought not to be a defense transactional relationship. I mean, we are not in this to sell things to India. I mean, I would like to sell things to India. But the objective ought to be, how do I beef up India's defense capabilities? And if beefing up those defense capabilities requires us to accept that India will buy certain systems outside the United States, so be it. So be it. But that is the kind of thinking that I think we need to.
You know, for a long time there has been this notion that while we want to sort of do business with the US and
Yes.
things, there is still a slightly Cold War mentality that there is a bit of a distrust
Yes.
that when push comes to shove, might just walk away from us.
Yes.
Is that a valid fear to have for India?
I think if I were in India's place, I would have that fear. Because there is a history to the US-India relationship
Right.
that goes back to some great moments of cooperation during the Cold War and also some terribly embarrassing moments. And that challenge is going to be perennial. And it's going to be perennial for a very simple structural reason. The United States is a global hegemonic power. It has interests of different sorts all over the world. The US-India relationship is just one dimension of those interests.
Of course.
And so we will be pursuing policies that sometimes will be competitive with India's interests. Now, in many ways, that does not apply to a country like Russia, which is a second tier or even a third tier power, because they do not have the global interests of the kind that the US has. So they can afford to, in a sense, sequence their interests to making India a priority in a way that the United States will find more difficult. Now, we've made extraordinary efforts in making India a priority in the last 20 years.
Right.
But we will never be perfectly congruent. And I think to have expectations that this will be a perfectly congruent relationship, I think that is unrealistic. So we have to just learn to live with the fact that there will be some dissonance that will be built into this strategic partnership.
Right.
And we have to constantly be looking for ways to manage that dissonance when it arrives.
I think you put it in a very easy to understand fashion. I think people will understand. Last question, simply for my own interest, just a yes or no, perhaps. There's a lot of talk that there's a possibility of President Trump going to Moscow May 9th, which would put him on the same platform as Putin, Xi, and Trump. Do you see that happening?
Well, let's put it this way. If it happens, it would be a very tragic day for us because I think Putin has not shown himself either a friend of our closest partners or our closest friend. President Trump may have his own reasons for going to Moscow, but if he goes to Moscow at this juncture, where Russia still sees the United States as its single most important adversary, I think that would be unfortunate.
That was Dr. Ashley J. Tellis talking to us about the Indo-US relationship at a time when the whole world seems to be in flux over President Donald J. Trump's next move. I do hope you enjoyed this particular edition of The Gist, and I look forward to seeing you again. Till then, this is Ramananda Sengupta.